Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales. There are many great and famous figures in the so-called Viking Age. Some genuinely historical, such as Ivar Benlosi or Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Harald Hardrada, Rollo of Normandy, or Canute the Great, among many others. And there are some who are, well, very questionable as to their actual existence, being probably fictional representations inspired by possibly actual people, Ragnar Lothbrok and Lagertha, for example. In England, where much of the action of the Viking Age took place, we have names like Alfred the Great, Harold Godwinson, Edmund Ironside, King Aelor of Northumbria, and so on, well known to anyone interested in that era of history. But there is one name that is far less well known, indeed almost forgotten at times, but should be mentioned along with the others whenever this period of history is talked about. A name as great as any of them, and greater than some, in fact. But sadly, it is a woman's name. And unfortunately, women in history have often been overlooked or their achievements played down, sometimes almost written out of history altogether. The greatest pirate, for example, the greatest pirate in history was not Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, or Sir Henry Morgan. No, it was a woman in China, Xing Isao, who commanded as many as 80,000 men and had an enormous fleet of ships. The British Royal Navy gave up trying to deal with her, and she was so powerful that even the Emperor of China bowed to her. Or in the United States, you will hear of Cochise, Sitting Bull, or Geronimo. But did you ever hear of Losen? Losen, the great warrior medicine woman of the Apache tribe, who in fact rode beside Geronimo, advising and guiding him in his campaign against the U.S. Army, and he would not make any move without consulting her first? No, you see, the Apache men resented her, a woman who held position above them, and the United States Army wasn't exactly chuffed about a woman making fools of them, running rings around them all over the place. So it is perhaps not surprising that the woman I want to talk about here in Anglo-Saxon England is not remembered as she should be, as she deserves to be, very much deserves to be. Now, she is very well portrayed, I must say, in Bernard Cornwell's excellent novels, The Saxon Stories, which later were adapted for the television series The Last Kingdom, where she is also shown as the powerful character she actually was. But, since there was no Anglo-Saxon title for a single female ruler, because, well, they just didn't have single female rulers, she was known as the Lady of Mercia, and an Irish chronicler referred to her as the most famous queen. Her name was Æthelflæd. Now, she was the eldest child of King Alfred the Great of Wessex and his wife, Ealhswith, born circa 869 AD, and it seems that King Alfred was devoted to her, more so than would have been the case as a rule with female children in those times, and she received an education that would normally have been reserved for a royal son. In January of 878 AD, when she was about 9 years old, the comfort of royal life ended rather abruptly, and she had to go on the run, so to speak. Viking raiders attacking the palace where King Alfred was staying, he and his family barely escaping with their lives, and hiding in marshes to avoid capture by the Danes until May of that year, when Alfred was able to raise an army and gain control of Wessex once more. Young Æthelflæd had a very early taste of warfare, something that may perhaps have molded her character later in life, remembering her time as a hunted fugitive hiding in a marsh. That is the sort of thing that does tend to stick in one's mind. Around the year 886 AD, still in her teens, she was married off to Æthelred, the Ealdorman of Mercia, known as the Lord of the Mercians, a nobleman who had previously pledged allegiance to her father and was recognized by him as King of Mercia. But in return, Æthelred had to acknowledge Wessex as superior to Mercia, though Alfred did give him the city of London as a sweetener, it having been previously Mercian. So Alfred really was only giving him something that was really already his, but, well, I suppose he meant well. Alfred had planned the marriage very, very well. He clearly loved his daughter, but he was also a very cunning ruler, and she would enjoy a power and status within her marriage in Mercia far greater than would have been the case in the much more restrictive Wessex. And while giving her as nice a marriage as possible under the circumstances, that would also very nicely give Alfred considerable sway in Mercia. Oh yes, he was thinking. The couple had one child, a daughter named Æthelflæd. The marriage was, of course, an entirely political one. Love didn't come into it. It was solely designed to strengthen the two kingdoms against Danish and Norwegian attacks to the north. And though the marriage wasn't a bad one, under normal 9th century arrangements, Æthelflæd would probably have vanished from official records, just remaining in the background, being a dutiful wife and mother and producing babies, as many babies as possible. But this was Mercia. And Æthelflæd had no intention of being simply a dutiful baby factory or being overshadowed by anybody, including her husband. Not that he ever seemed actually to even try. It probably wouldn't have succeeded if he had. And she is later recorded as signing important documents and presiding over court proceedings in place of Æthelflæd, something I'll be looking at in a moment. Now, at around the same time, King Alfred had agreed a treaty with the Danes, establishing the so-called Danelaw. Now, that was a large region of England that included the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and a good part of Mercia, which would be under Danish control, in exchange for the Danes agreeing to leave the kingdom of Wessex alone. On the face of it, that might seem a good arrangement, but did he have the right to do that? He wasn't king of any of those regions. So his agreement to let the Danes have them in exchange for the safety of the realm he was king of, Wessex, it seems a bit questionable at the least, both from legal and moral viewpoints. Now, Alfred was no coward, and he had just won a major battle with the Danes, but he had won a battle. He had not won the war. The Danes still had powerful forces. And Alfred had no idea if he could win another similar great engagement, so he took the easy way out. And the Danes, of course, they were quite happy to accept, gaining what they wanted, control over most of England without having to fight for it. But neither Æthelred nor Æthelflæd were very impressed by the treaty, especially the loss of large areas of Mercia, and the fact that the Danes were constantly raiding the remaining part of Mercia. Having agreed to leave Wessex alone, yes, but see, Mercia wasn't included in the deal as far as they were concerned, so they just happily raided away. The new rulers of Mercia decided to have none of that carry-on, and they fought back against the Danish incursions, eventually deciding to do more than just resist, but to take back the areas they regarded as stolen property. The fighting husband and wife team of Æthelred and Æthelflæd, the dynamic duo, I suppose we might call them, went into action with great gusto, and they were recapturing large areas of former Mercian lands from the Danes in the Midlands and further to the north. Now, it has been suggested that it was actually Æthelflæd who was responsible for much of the military leadership at this time, given later events, as well as the successful strategies that were employed, such as the increasing fortification of the Mercian border, which seems to have been her idea. She certainly demonstrated military leadership and a knowledge of very, very cunning strategy at the Battle of Chester, which occurred in 907 AD. Now, this battle was not fought against marauding Danish bands coming in from the Danelaw. No, it was fought rather against mostly settled Norwegians from Ireland. They were refugees, you might say, who had been driven out of Dyfflin, modern-day Dublin, following an uprising by the native Irish in 902 AD. They made a very unsuccessful attack on Wales, and then they went looking for somewhere to set up some sort of living space, deciding on nearby Mercia, where, since Æthelred was already unwell, they had petitioned Æthelflæd for permission to settle in her lands, she agreeing to let them settle on the Wirral Peninsula near the city of Chester, on the very strict condition that they cause no harm to Mercia. Now, this seems to me to indicate that she was quite a compassionate woman, willing to show sympathy to refugees in need of somewhere to live, and ignoring the fact that they were pagans, not demanding that they convert to her own faith in return for hospitality, as she might have done. But she was also not a fool. And she took precautions against any possible treachery, realizing the potential danger of a Norse settlement within her own borders, one that might well join with fellow Scandinavians in the Danelaw, which was quite possible. And she ordered the strengthening of Chester's defensive walls. These were fortifications over 400 years old, dating from when Chester had been an important Roman fortress, but they were still in serviceable condition. The Romans built pretty well. She had enhanced the existing Roman walls, and she had new walls constructed, running from the southeast and northwest corners of the old Roman defences down to the nearby River Dee. Given later events, her foresight was well founded. Sadly, things didn't go quite to plan on the Wirral, and the more boisterous militaristic elements among the Irish Norsemen decided to attempt an uprising of their own, launching unsuccessful attacks on nearby Chester, which were repulsed by the recently strengthened city walls. When news reached her of the uprising, Æthelflæd hurried to Chester, but she went alone, her husband's health being in decline. And on that point, entries in the so-called Mercian Register, that's also known as the Annals of Æthelflæd. That's a name given to entries from 902 to 924 AD in several versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, reporting events from the Mercian point of view as against the very biased anti-Mercian, pro-Wessex, West Saxon reporting in the main chronicle. And the Irish Annals, called the Three Fragments, from 902 AD onwards, record her frequently acting alone in military operations and in government, though sometimes also in conjunction with her husband, such as in 903 AD, when they both attended a meeting with her brother, King Edward the Elder of Wessex, at which he witnessed a charter. But this was the last recorded act on his part. There are no surviving documents after that date witnessed by him, and it was Æthelflæd who witnessed them thereafter, which is a clear indication of her husband's declining condition. That fact alone gives credence to the suggestion of his poor health, she replacing him in pretty much all official duties, which would not have been the case had he been in good health. He was much older than she was. He'd spent much of his life fighting, and presumably was quite content to let his wife, capable as of course she was, run the kingdom. Anyway, taking command at Chester, she devised a brilliant plan to attack the Norwegians outside the city, but then to pretend to fall back, fleeing back through the city gates, hotly pursued, of course, by the Norsemen, who poured through the gates into the city. However, the streets had been blocked off, and the gates were slammed shut behind the attackers, trapping them in a confined space with little room to maneuver, which today I suppose we would call a kill zone. Æthelflæd's soldiers charging in to attack us, as townspeople reportedly dropped a variety of strange things on them from the city walls, including stones, boiling beer, and even beehives. A beehive landing on your head probably would actually quite spoil your day. The would-be attackers were slaughtered, and thus she won the Battle of Chester, going on to further strengthen the defences of the city and of Mercia in general. She continued to take the fight against the Danes. At the Battle of Tettenhall in 910 AD, when several prominent leaders from the Danelaw assembled a fleet and sailed up the River Severn right into the heart of Mercia. They were collecting large amounts of plunder, but they were caught by a combined Mercian and West Saxon army, and according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they were defeated with heavy losses. 3 Danish leaders were said to have been killed, and the image of Æthelflæd, mighty warrior queen, bearing 3 royal swords, was born on that day. After battling poor health since around 902, Æthelred died in 911 AD, and Æthelflæd became the sole ruler of Mercia, guiding the destiny of her realm for 7 more years, which was an unheard of achievement for an Anglo-Saxon woman. But since there was no official title for a lone female ruler, her mother, Æthelflæd, wife of Alfred the Great, was simply known as the wife of the king. Æthelred was called the Lady of the Mercians, and the lady proved herself an equal of any man who had ever ruled in Anglo-Saxon England, consolidating her territory that would eventually extend from Gloucester to Northumbria, from Derby to the Welsh border, leading armies in battle and founding new towns. That was following a strategy developed by her father, Alfred the Great, the so-called burhs, fortified towns forming a defensive network across the land, set 30 or 40 miles apart, from which we get the term borough today. These new towns were surrounded by strong walls and garrisoned, and they could prevent Danish inroads much more easily than was possible previously, the garrisons from various burghs being able to coordinate their attacks. And the burghs themselves were strong enough to resist attack, since marauding bands of Danes or occasional Norwegians, well, they would not come equipped with siege equipment. In time, these burghs grew from small fortified encampments into quite substantial towns. Bridgnorth, founded in 910, Stafford and Tamworth in 913, Warwick in 914, along with Runcorn and Shrewsbury. Æthelflæd was hedging her bets, though, supplementing the strong military defences with spiritual ones. Oh yes, each town had a fine new church constructed. No harm to get God on her side. Always a good move. By July of 917 AD, she launched a major offensive against raiders coming over into Mercia from Leicester and Northampton, surrounding them in the fortress at Derby, which lay in the area of Mercia under Danish control, where the ruler of that town had seemingly joined with the raiders. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, with God's help, before Lammas obtained the borough that is called Derby, with all that belonged to it. There were also killed 4 thanes who were dear to her inside the gates. Thus, this was a very critical victory. See, Derby was one of the so-called 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, and its capture was very symbolic, sending a very clear message to the Danelaw in general. The Lady of Mercia was coming. The following year she marched on to Leicester, another important Danish settlement, where the Jarls there readily offered to submit to her rule. A wise decision, and probably helped by the fact that she was not a conqueror who massacred those who surrendered to her, nor tortured or killed anyone who refused to convert to Christianity, and they could expect fair treatment at her hands. The capture of Derby and Leicester, of course, caused Danish rule to weaken considerably, and it gave notice of more to come, a major blow to their entire control of the region. But Æthelflæd had greater plans. Oh yes, she was looking beyond the territories of Mercia, not simply taking back more Mercian territory. It was time to strike a decisive blow against the treaty her father had agreed with the Danes, a treaty she had never accepted. So, not content with retaking just Mercian territory, she decided to march to the north and retake Northumbria, preparing to aim for the greatest prize of all, the most important Danish city in the whole of England, Jorvik, or York, as we know it today, a trading centre and a hub of Scandinavian activity. Take Jorvik, and she would take Northumbria, and virtually destroy the Danelaw in the process. But it was not to be. Fate robbed the Lady of Mercia of what would have been her greatest triumph, and guaranteed her an unassailable place in history. Just as the Danes of Jorvik were apparently ready to offer her either their submission or at least an alliance with her, realizing that Danish power was in decline and their position, should they refuse, was questionable to say the least, she fell ill and died, possibly of dysentery, though we can't be sure, on the 12th of June, 918 AD at Tamworth, only about 49 years old. Her body taken back to be buried with her husband at St. Oswald's Priory in Gloucester. But she had achieved a great deal, even though she failed to take Jorvik. At the time of her death, her kingdom was becoming peaceful. She had ended the Danish incursions and recovered territory that had previously been lost. And it was prosperous. She had founded 6 new towns and refurbished and strengthened others. She had become both feared by her foes and respected by friend and foe alike, her name known across Europe, described by the Anglo-Norman William of Malmesbury as a powerful accession to Edward's party, the delight of his subjects, the dread of his enemies, a woman of enlarged soul. And yes, she had done it as a woman in a male-dominated age. She was succeeded on the throne by her only child, her daughter, Æthelflæd, becoming the second Lady of the Mercians. Unfortunately, she never got the chance to show if she could have risen to the heights of her great mother, since her reign was a very brief one, ending when King Edward the Elder of Wessex, her uncle, had her deposed, and fearful for her safety, she spent the rest of her life in seclusion in a nunnery. Nice uncle. With relatives like that, who needs enemies? Æthelflæd was succeeded by her cousin, Athelstan, who had been raised actually at Æthelflæd's court. Athelstan later ruled over both Mercia and Wessex and would become the first king of a united England, fulfilling Alfred the Great's dream of one united English nation, which had of course been begun by Æthelflæd when she began seizing territory back from the Danelaw. It is a sad footnote to history that the wonderful Lady of Mercia is overshadowed by the men who surrounded her during her life. Her father, Alfred the Great, her husband, Æthelred of Mercia, her brother, King Edward the Elder of Wessex, and her nephew, Athelstan, the king of the whole of Britain. Yet the historian Michael Wood has suggested that despite her lack of recognition later on, partly in her own time, and very much so today, as he put it, without her, England might never have happened. And that is very true. She, not Alfred the Great, began what led to the final unification of England, Athelstan completing what she had begun. In the 12th century, the historian Henry of Huntingdon gave Æthelflæd a remarkable tribute, calling her so powerful that in praise and exaltation of her wonderful gifts, some call her not only lady, but even king, worthy of a man's name, more illustrious than Caesar, going on to honour her in poetic fashion that goes thus: Heroic Æthelflæd, great in martial fame, a man in valour, woman though in name, these warlike hosts the nature too obeyed, conquered or both, though born by sex a maid, changed be thy name, such honour, triumphs being, a queen by title, but in deeds a king. Heroes before the Mercian heroine quailed, Caesar himself to win such glory failed. Yeah, I get the feeling he rather liked her. In the West Saxon version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as we have seen, she was simply called King Edward's sister. Those in Wessex not wishing to give her her proper due. But in the Mercian register, she was the Lady of the Mercians, and both Welsh and Irish annals referred to her as Queen, the famous Annals of Ulster calling her the renowned Saxon Queen, that much respected document having failed altogether even to mention the passing of both Alfred and Edward the Elder. And as we have seen, the later Anglo-Norman chroniclers were loud in their praise of her. Henry of Huntingdon heaping praise on her as a ruler and military leader, and William of Malmesbury suggesting that she had put the realm ahead of her marital obligations, deciding not to have more children after the birth of her daughter because of the risks women faced in childbirth in those times, which could pose a threat to her life, which of course would also pose a threat to the realm. He records that she declined sexual relations, quote, unbecoming of the daughter of a king, to give away to a delight which, after a time, produced such painful consequences. Of course, skeptics might suggest that perhaps Æthelflæd just wasn't very impressive in the bedroom department. Pass on from that. Like Alfred, her overly religious father, who spent much of his time on his knees praying when he wasn't building churches all over the place or allegedly burning cakes in a marsh, she fully believed in the power of faith. She was very religious, as many were in those days, seeing the church as a mighty bulwark against what she would have seen as the evils of paganism. And she invested considerable money in establishing new churches and restoring old ones, especially in the city of Gloucester, which she had transformed from a pretty dreary provincial little town of no great importance into a bustling centre of commerce, becoming the principal town of Mercia. To the church there she brought the body of St. Oswald, seen as a very important and precious holy relic, which had been held by the Danes at Bardony in Lincolnshire, but she had been able to get them to release the body, which she returned to Mercia amid much rejoicing and celebrations. Keeping the church happy was always a good idea in those days. Despite her fame as a military leader, her legacy was not simply one of successful combat. She believed in education, much as her father had done, using the monastic establishments to spread learning, which was the way it was done at that time, and she took pains to improve the general status of her realm, being a ruler who seems to have genuinely cared about the welfare of her subjects. She was, in my mind, every bit as great as her father, perhaps perhaps even greater, not simply giving in to the Danes and other Nordic raiders who wished to settle and colonize England, but aggressively fighting back, recovering lost territory, even desiring to retake Northumbria, something her father, well, something he never even attempted. Her reputation spread across not only England, but also across the realms of Europe. And rather surprisingly, the later Normans, themselves, of course, simply descendants of the very Norsemen she had fought against so fiercely, they fell over themselves to heap praise upon her, regarding her as a great military leader, great warriors themselves, and obviously respecting her abilities, even though she was a woman. So one might wonder, why is she so little known today? Why her image seemed to fade away after Norman times? On the face of it, it just seemed rather strange. Being largely ignored by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of course, was part of the problem, I suppose, Wessex not wishing to have a woman from Mercia seen as a great English hero, and it has been suggested that it was her own brother, King Edward the Elder, who had her written out of it. And given what he did to her daughter who succeeded her, I'm inclined to think he possibly did, though that fact seems not to have influenced the Anglo-Norman chroniclers. Whatever the reason, her name was largely forgotten in following centuries, and another woman would come to be seen as the great warrior queen of England. Not that England as such even existed in her time, or that she actually accomplished anything of real lasting value, and that was the Queen of the Iceni in ancient Britain, Boadicea. Yet Boadicea's revolt was a total failure. I mean, brave though she undoubtedly was, one can't question that. She was a fine and obviously inspiring leader. But her only real achievement being the rather unnecessarily brutal massacre of Roman civilians, especially the horrible tortures committed against Roman women who had not actually done her any harm. Her quarrel had been with the tax collectors who raped her and her daughters. But Æthelflæd's military exploits had been successful. She achieved her goals. She brought eventual peace and prosperity to the land, while Boadicea's legacy had been to bring brutal revenge down upon her own people. So brutal, in fact, that Emperor Nero actually castigated the governor of Britannia, Suetonius Paulinus, for excessive cruelty. Nero blaming his own Roman officials for causing the revolt in the first place. Yet it is Boadicea's large and impressive statue that stands in London today, commemorating a failed uprising and woefully excessive brutality, while the successful and lasting exploits of Æthelflæd of Mercia, achieved without any great brutality more than was required, are represented by a small statue in Tamworth, erected in 1913, a more recent one showing her with a sword and spear, and some minor monuments to her elsewhere, but nothing so grand and well known as Boadicea's statue in London, situated at one end of Westminster Bridge and showing the heroic queen in her war chariot with her two daughters by her side, a famous London icon. Alfred the Great is mentioned in every history book, every television documentary, every school history lesson as the mighty scourge of the Danish invaders, the wonderful heroic king who saved England. I recently saw a video about him in which he was described as the saviour of the Saxons, even though in fact he did no such thing, unless one was a Saxon living in Wessex, but the Saxons living in East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria, well, they didn't really get a whole lot of salvation from him. They simply got handed over to the Danes, while his daughter is hardly ever mentioned at all, other than being listed as one of his children. Alfred the Great is really a lie. He didn't save England. Far from it. He saved his own kingdom of Wessex at the expense of the rest of England, which he handed to the Danes, something that is always ignored. And it was actually Æthelstan who would eventually unite the realm, becoming king of all England in 937 AD after defeating a combined army of Norwegians, Scots, and Irish, along with some Danes, finishing what Æthelflæd, not Alfred, had begun. How should she be remembered today? Should she be seen as just the daughter of Alfred the Great, Alfred the not so great as he actually was, or be remembered as an amazing woman, a mighty warrior queen, achieving things thought only possible for a man in her time? Is she not a splendid role model for girls today, when we like to have strong female characters in movies and television shows, Game of Thrones, Vikings, The Last Kingdom, or The Lord of the Rings and the like? Powerful female characters too long overdue, in fact, in popular culture, where for decades poor little women needed big, strong men to rescue them from the evil clutches of the villain. I prefer female characters who can rescue themselves. Cara Dune in The Mandalorian, or Brienne of Tarth in Game of Thrones, for example. For me, it is the Lady of Mercia, whose statue should be seen as an iconic tribute in London, admired and photographed by countless tourists every year, commemorating great political and military achievements, not Boadicea, who was, let's be fair about this, really, ignoring her courage. She was, to all intents and purposes, a total failure, who really accomplished, well, nothing. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, hopefully you will subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. And so, until next time, I shall say farewell. Goodbye for now.